don't forget, that boy wasn't born a great general. Picture a cold winter morning in the run-down Subura district of Rome, where you see a 6-year-old Gaius Julius Caesar sitting by a window. He's not the kind of child you'd pick out of a crowd. Brown hair falling messily over his forehead, eyes a bit dreamy, as if thinking of something far away. But then suddenly, he turns to you and whispers, "I'll be Rome's hero." You chuckle, but his eyes don't joke. That night, in a small house filled with the smell of smoky wood and stale bread, his mother told him stories of heroic generals. Caesar sat silent, his eyes lighting up every time she mentioned Alexander the Great. In the shadows, you hear him murmur, "I'll be like him," but more. The next day, as he ran down a cobbled street, he picked up a broken stick and swung it like a sword. You saw the sparkle in his eyes, that hint of joy. "When I grow up, I'll have an army. I'll conquer the world." You shrugged, but somehow that idea stayed with you. As time passed, you watched his family fall on hard times after his father's death. They weren't wealthy, but his mother remained determined, telling her son that honor was everything. "You can be poor, but never be dishonorable," she said. And that phrase, you remember it clearly, planted in Caesar's young soul a stubborn faith that couldn't be extinguished. One hot afternoon, young Julius ran into the street with a few friends. They played marching games with wooden sticks, shouting orders. You heard Caesar yell, "Legion, advance, conquer Rome." But the other kids laughed. "Rome's already ours, you fool." Caesar frowned, but instead of getting angry, he just smirked and said, "Then we'll build a bigger Rome." Historians still debate whether in those childhood years Caesar truly dreamed of greatness, or if it was just childish play. But seeing the look in his eyes, you know it wasn't just a game. When Caesar was 12, you clearly remember that stormy day, rain pouring down as he and his mother trudged through muddy streets to school. In the cramped classroom, the old teacher lectured on history and philosophy, but young Julius scribbled down notes about Hannibal's and Scipio Africanus's military feats. He'd often ask the teacher odd questions like, "Do you think Scipio felt lonely without his troops?" Or, "Was Hannibal ever scared?" You overheard the teacher's annoyed reply, "Scipio was Scipio and Hannibal was Hannibal. Don't compare them." But Caesar only smiled and kept writing. One day, you happened to glance at his notebook. Alongside historical notes, there were crude maps of imaginary fortresses and battle lines. One spring afternoon, while the other kids played on the Aventine Hill, Caesar stared northward and said softly, "One day I'll lead an army across the Alps." You laughed. "Why?" He answered so quietly it was like he was talking to himself. "So Rome won't fear anyone again." Here's something few know. Young Caesar wasn't into running and playing like the other kids. He often spent afternoons under a tree, arranging pebbles and twigs into little strategy games. Once, when you asked why he didn't join the ball game, he replied, "Kicking a ball is fun, but commanding an army is way more exciting." Oddly enough, there was the time Caesar almost drowned while swimming across the Tiber River. You remember the day he dared you and the other kids to race. He swam the farthest, but near the far bank, he cramped up. You and the others panicked, but Caesar just clenched his teeth, struggled, and eventually reached the shore. When he stood there, pale and breathless but smiling, you heard him mutter, "Can't die yet. Rome's still waiting for me." That night, in the cramped little room, Young Julius sat gazing at the flickering oil lamp, his eyes wide open in the dark. You heard him whisper, "Someday, people will tell stories about me, just like I'm telling stories about Alexander now." It wasn't long before Caesar's life twisted with the currents of Roman politics. You remember the day he was barely 16 when he stood at his father's funeral, lips pressed tightly, hands trembling slightly, as he held the family's modest ceremonial staff. Around him, the whispers of relatives and neighbors rippled like the hush before a storm. His cousin nudged him, whispering, "You'll have to be the man of the family now." Caesar just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes locked on the smoldering funeral pyre. But that's when everything took a turn. You see, the political tides in Rome were shifting faster than a river in flood season. Caesar's uncle by marriage was none other than Gaius Marius, the powerful general who clashed with Sulla, Rome's other strong man. When Sulla seized power as dictator, many families connected to Marius faced swift danger. One cold evening, you found yourself huddled with Caesar and his mother as a messenger banged on the door, breathless. "They're coming," he whispered hoarsely, and without a moment's hesitation, Caesar's mother pushed him out the back door, murmuring, "Run, my son, run, and don't look back." That night, you and Caesar crouched under the arches of a broken aqueduct, trembling in the dark. His cloak was too thin, and the chill of the stones seeped into your bones. He was shivering, but he clenched his fists. "They'll not catch me," he whispered fiercely. "I'll return. One day I'll return stronger." Historians still debate whether Sulla truly ordered Caesar's execution or simply intended to scare him. But it's a fact that Caesar disappeared from the city for a time, slipping through the cracks like a shadow. You heard rumors in the marketplace, whispers of how he evaded the soldiers, sometimes by disguising himself as a commoner, sometimes by hiding in wine barrels sent down the Tiber. In exile, Caesar's life wasn't the glamorous escape one might imagine. You remember the lean months, how he wandered from village to village, offering to teach grammar to local children just to earn a loaf of bread. One afternoon, you sat with him in a cramped kitchen where he scrawled Latin lessons on the back of a piece of old parchment while munching on a crust of stale bread. He glanced at you and grinned wryly. Well, even Alexander had to start somewhere. But don't forget that quiet night when Caesar, staring at the stars, confided in you a dream that still gives you chills. "One day, they'll call me Imperator," he said softly, almost afraid of his own ambition. "Not because of family, not because of birth, but because I'll make them." It was during this wandering that you first heard him speak of Cosutia, the wealthy heiress his family had arranged for him to marry. He shook his head as he told you, his voice low with frustration, "They think a rich wife will save our name. But I can't marry for money. That's not how you build Rome." And so, against all advice, he broke off the engagement. It was one of those moments you recognized as pure Caesar, a stubbornness wrapped in charm. One damp evening, as you both sat in a smoky tavern, he suddenly leaned in, lowering his voice. "Do you think Sulla will ever forgive me?" You hesitated before you could answer. He laughed softly. "No, I suppose not. That's why I'll have to make him irrelevant." Later that same night, when the world seemed asleep, Caesar found his way back into Rome under a false name, slipping through the gates like a shadow, merging with the city's heartbeat. You stayed close, feeling the pulse of danger in the air. His mother, upon seeing him, burst into tears, but Caesar only hugged her briefly, whispering, "Don't worry, I'll make sure we're safe." A little-known detail, you noticed. Caesar, even in his youth, had a habit of sharpening his dagger not just for protection, but almost meditatively. Sitting by a flickering lamp, you watched him slowly run the blade over the whetstone, the rasping sound oddly soothing. "It's not just for fighting," he murmured. "It's a reminder of focus." And then there was the day, bright and almost painfully blue, when Caesar was summoned to Sulla's court. You can still hear the heavy knock on the door, the rustle of the official's toga as he delivered the summons. His mother pleaded, her voice breaking, but Caesar stood tall, straightened his cloak, and said quietly, "It's time I faced him." Some say Sulla's decision to pardon Caesar was a whim. Others claim it was fear of the young man's charisma. But as Caesar walked out of that courtroom, his expression unreadable, you realized something profound. He wasn't just surviving, he was already beginning to conquer. After that brush with death, you saw a change in him. His youthful arrogance hadn't faded, but it was now tempered with a quiet cunning. One crisp morning, while strolling down the forum with you, he glanced at the bustling stalls and murmured, "Rome's a stage, and I'm not ready to exit." His smile was faint, almost conspiratorial. Determined to solidify his place, he pursued the role of military tribune. Remember how he stood in front of the consuls, his voice smooth yet determined, weaving words like a practiced orator. His application wasn't just a formality, it was his declaration. And when he finally secured the position, he didn't celebrate with wild feasts or grand gestures. Instead, he turned to you and said softly, "This is just the prologue." His first assignment was in Asia Minor, and you still recall the morning he boarded the ship. Sleek sails catching the dawn's light, the scent of the sea mixing with the spice-laden air of the port. As the waves rocked beneath your feet, he stood at the prow, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They say Alexander cried when he ran out of worlds to conquer," he mused. "I haven't even begun." A little-known fact. During this campaign, Caesar's ship was intercepted by pirates off the coast of Cilicia. You remember how the crew panicked, but Caesar, leaning casually against the rail, simply chuckled and remarked to you, "Well, this should be interesting." He was captured and held for ransom, but instead of despairing, he charmed his captors, joking with them, even promising, half in jest, that he'd return to punish them once he was free. And true to his word, after the ransom was paid and he was released, he raised a small force, hunted down the pirates, and had them crucified. But even then, he ordered their deaths be made merciful by Roman standards, a strange twist of honor. Historians still debate whether this was an early sign of his calculated ruthlessness or merely a young man's impulsive justice. It was during this time, as you sat with him one starlit night, that he shared a peculiar fear. "You know," he said, swirling wine in a wooden cup, "I'm afraid I'll grow old before I do anything worth remembering." You teased him, "You're not even 30." But he only smiled faintly, shadows playing across his face. When he returned to Rome, triumphant but modest in his recounting, his mother embraced him with tearful pride. But not everyone was so welcoming. You overheard whispers in the Senate, "That Marius boy, he thinks he's clever." Yet Caesar, undeterred, began weaving a network of alliances. One afternoon, Over a shared plate of olives and bread in a quiet courtyard, he laid out his vision: marry into the right families, earn loyalty through favors, win hearts before battles. Rome isn't won by the sword alone. It's won by whispers and smiles. It wasn't long before he made his most politically savvy marriage to Cornelia, daughter of the powerful Cinna. Their union, more a strategic partnership than a romance, secured his place among the populares, the faction championing the cause of the common people. But you noticed how, despite the calculated nature of the match, he treated Cornelia with unexpected tenderness. "She's my anchor," he once confided quietly. But Rome was a dangerous place, and ambition attracted not just allies, but enemies. Remember the time he was ambushed on his way home from a Senate meeting? You can still picture the shadowy figures stepping from alleyways, blades glinting under the moonlight. Caesar, ever quick-witted, diffused the situation with a mix of charm and bluffing. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "if you intended harm, at least let me finish my wine." You both laughed nervously afterward, but the danger was real. It was during one of those tense evenings that he turned to you and whispered, "I'll have to be faster than them, smarter, louder, but always a step ahead." By the time he was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, you realized Caesar wasn't just maneuvering through politics. He was crafting a legend. Few know that his election was marred by accusations of bribery and scandalous rumors, but his victory was decisive. And as he stepped onto the temple steps that morning, sunlight catching the folds of his toga, he murmured to you, "Even the gods favor the bold." You'll never forget the way Caesar's life seemed to surge forward after his return. His ambition was now as clear as the marble arches of the Forum, and you could feel the undercurrent of it each time he stepped into a gathering of Rome's elite. One late afternoon, he leaned in close, the scent of fresh figs on his breath, and murmured with a playful glint, "The trick isn't just to make them listen, it's to make them want to hear more." Soon after, he secured a position as quaestor, and it wasn't long before he was sent to Hispania. You remember how his eyes gleamed at the prospect. The moment the orders were read aloud, he grinned and said, "Spain, huh? Let's see what the provinces can teach us." What he didn't say out loud, but you could sense, was that he saw Hispania not just as an assignment, but as a proving ground. And so off you went, the dusty roads stretching out before you, the landscape shifting from olive groves to rugged mountains. Along the way, Caesar's natural charm unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. At one remote village, he stopped to help a shepherd pull a stuck mule from a ditch. "A general's got to know when to lend a hand," he joked, wiping dust from his hands. The real transformation, though, came when he encountered the battered remains of a Roman force defeated by local tribes. You remember standing beside him, the wind tugging at his cloak as he surveyed the scene. His jaw tightened, his voice low. "Rome forgets these men too easily, but I won't." It was there, amid the broken shields and scattered spears, that he started planning, not just for battle, but for how he'd restore Rome's pride. That evening by the campfire, you heard him muttering numbers under his breath. When you asked what he was counting, he replied, "The men I'll need to take Hispania back." His strategies were meticulous, and though he was technically a junior officer, he found ways to influence decisions, nudging commanders with subtle suggestions that felt like their own ideas. That evening by the campfire, you heard him muttering numbers under his breath. When you asked what he was counting, he replied, "The men I'll need to take Hispania back." His strategies were meticulous, and though he was technically a junior officer, he found ways to influence decisions, nudging commanders with subtle suggestions that felt like their own ideas. Yet, his ambitions wouldn't stay confined to charming moments or local skirmishes. News of a wider rebellion reached your camp, and with a decisive snap of his fingers, Caesar organized his forces. He moved like a chess master, predicting his opponent's moves before they even made them. One evening, as you stood together overlooking the enemy's campfires in the valley below, he whispered, "They think we're disorganized. They're in for a surprise." The battle that followed wasn't epic in scale, but it was a masterstroke of strategy. Caesar used the terrain, timing his attack with the rising mist, so his forces seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The local chieftains, taken by surprise, surrendered without much resistance. Historians still argue whether Caesar's tactics were innovative or simply lucky, but that night, under the glow of the campfires, he sat beside you and murmured, "Luck favors those who make it." After the victory, as his men cheered and raised their goblets, Caesar remained uncharacteristically quiet. You noticed him gazing at the distant mountains, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think a single victory would be enough. But now I see it's not just about winning. It's about making sure everyone knows you've won." That winter in Hispania, with snow dusting the ground and the wind slicing through the camp, he began drafting letters back to Rome. You watched as he dipped his stylus, the scratch of it against the wax tablet punctuated by the occasional sigh. "They'll know my name soon enough," he said, half to himself, half to you. And by the time spring thawed the icy roads, he had earned the respect not just of his superiors, but of his men. The soldiers spoke of him in hushed, admiring tones, noting his fairness in sharing spoils and his uncanny ability to turn near defeat into victory. You once overheard a grizzled centurion mutter, "That young Caesar's got Jupiter's luck." As you both prepared to leave Hispania, with the fields blooming and the air thick with the scent of almond blossoms, Caesar turned to you and said with a sly smile, "Let's go home. Rome's waiting." When you returned to Rome, the air felt thicker, like the city itself was holding its breath. The streets thrummed with gossip, the Senate teemed with whispered deals and barely veiled rivalries. Caesar didn't step back into the shadows. No, he strolled into the city as though he owned every cobblestone underfoot. "We'll need allies," he said to you, the faint scent of olive oil wafting from a nearby vendor, "and not just fair weather ones." That's when he set his sights on forging the famous first triumvirate. You remember the first quiet dinner with Crassus, where Caesar leaned back and let the wealthiest man in Rome boast about his riches. "Tell me, Marcus," he asked with a tilt of his head, "how much gold does it take to silence a senate?" Crassus laughed, but you saw Caesar's fingers tapping an almost imperceptible rhythm on the table, calculating, always calculating. And then came Pompey. The meeting wasn't nearly as cordial. They exchanged cold pleasantries, each sizing up the other like gladiators circling in the arena. Later that night, as you both sat sipping watered wine under a moonlit portico, Caesar muttered, "He's no fool, but he's not as clever as he thinks. The trick will be to make him think this was his idea." It was classic Caesar, disarm with charm, then guide with invisible strings. Historians still debate which of these alliances was more important, or who really benefited the most. But sitting there beside him, you felt the weight of his ambition. The Senate doesn't fear a soldier, he mused quietly one evening, but a soldier with friends and a fortune? That they can't ignore. In between these high-stakes negotiations, there were moments of almost absurd normalcy. You'll never forget the afternoon he insisted on taking a break to visit an open-air market. He spent far too long haggling over a ridiculously overpriced bunch of dates. "The vendor thinks he's swindling me," Caesar whispered with a wink, "but sometimes it's worth paying extra for a good story." Another time, at a gathering in a marble-clad villa, he and Pompey found themselves in an impromptu debate about the best way to season roast boar. Caesar, ever the showman, declared with mock seriousness, "A true general knows the secret lies in the honey glaze, just enough to surprise the tongue, not so much it drowns the flavor." The room erupted in laughter, and even Pompey cracked a smile. It was ridiculous, yes, but it softened the tension between them. There was, however, one detail that few remember. Amid all this political maneuvering, Caesar quietly supported infrastructure projects, sponsoring repairs to aqueducts and roads. "It's not glamorous," he said once, "studying a crumbling stretch of stone road. But it's these things that make people's lives better, and happy people are easier to lead." The triumvirate was sealed not just by deals, but by marriages. You recall the intimate moment when Caesar arranged for his daughter Julia to marry Pompey. As she blushed beneath her veil, he whispered to you, "It's a gamble, but it's a gamble worth taking." His voice was tight, as though he knew that mixing family with politics was a recipe for heartbreak. That night, after the celebration had quieted and the guests had departed, Caesar sat alone under the flickering oil lamps, staring into his cup. "I wonder," he murmured, "if one day they'll remember this as the beginning of something or the end." His voice carried a weight that made your skin prickle. The Senate, of course, didn't sit idly by while Caesar amassed allies and influence. Rumors swirled, daggers flashed in the dark, not literal ones yet, but the political kind. "They'll try to clip my wings," he said to you one stormy evening, raindrops pelting against the mosaic tiles. "But I'll fly higher." And fly he did. His next move was to secure a governorship in Gaul, a region that promised not only wealth, but military glory. As you both stood overlooking the map spread out on a marble table, he traced the borders with a fingertip, whispering, "Gaul will make or break me." There was a mixture of hunger and apprehension in his eyes. You almost reminded him that not all conquests end in victory. But then, you thought, what was the point? He'd already decided. Before leaving for Gaul, he gave you a crooked smile, the kind that said he was already 3 steps ahead. "I'll write letters," he promised, "to make sure Rome hears of every victory, every setback. They'll think I'm 10 times greater than I am. And by the time they realize the truth, it'll be too late to stop me." You couldn't help but laugh. "So we're conquering Gaul with words, too?" He winked. "Always." You couldn't have imagined how Gaul would transform him and you. The moment you crossed into that vast, rugged land, you felt the air shift. The scent of pine and wet earth clung to your clothes, and the chill seeped into your bones. But Caesar? He seemed to breathe in the wildness like it was ambrosia. "You smell that?" he asked with a grin. "That's the scent of opportunity." And opportunity it was, though it came wrapped in blood and mud. He built his army into a living organism, its heart beating to his rhythm. "Every soldier must feel like they're part of something bigger," he said one night, as you sat around a campfire that hissed with rain. "Even if that something is my ambition." He laughed softly, but you could tell he meant every word. The first major encounter with the Helvetii tested his mettle. You recall how he stood at the edge of a battlefield choked with morning fog, his breath ghosting in the air. He muttered, half to himself, "They think we're outnumbered." Good. His strategy was a masterpiece of maneuvering. He used the terrain, the rivers, the very confusion of the enemy's advance to trap and decimate them. Yet later, as you shared a flask of watered wine by the fire, he murmured, "They'll call this brilliance." But it was mostly patience and knowing when not to panic. A little-known tidbit from that campaign: Caesar insisted on sharing his tent with a scruffy old dog that had followed the army since Italy. "Good for morale," he said, ruffling its ears. "And besides, it's nice to have someone who doesn't talk politics." It wasn't all victories, though. You still remember the bitter setback at Gergovia, where Vercingetorix's forces gave the legions a humiliating blow. That night, as the camp nursed its wounds, Caesar sat hunched over a half-eaten loaf of bread. "You win some, you lose some," he said, though his voice was tighter than usual. "But I'll make sure we don't lose twice." He kept his promise. The siege of Alesia that followed was a spectacle of engineering and nerve. You watched as he ordered trenches, fortifications, and counterwalls built with precision that would make a master sculptor jealous. "They'll say it was impossible," he told you, as if he were already imagining the historians writing his legacy. But impossible is just a word. The tension around Alesia was so thick, even the birds seemed to fly quieter. One evening, as you both stood atop a hastily built watchtower, you asked, "Aren't you afraid they'll break through?" He glanced at you, the torchlight flickering across his face. "Afraid? Always. But I don't let it decide for me." It was the kind of simple truth that settled into your bones. Amidst all the tactical brilliance, Caesar's eccentricities never faded. Once he halted a march for an hour just so he could listen to a traveling bard sing a song about a long-forgotten Roman hero. "Inspiration strikes when you least expect it," he said with a wink, then promptly ordered the army back into formation. And yes, there were moments of dark humor, like the time he found a local chieftain's statue, a crude thing of wood and clay, and decided it should be displayed in the camp as a reminder that even gods can be made of mud. The soldiers laughed, and even you couldn't help but chuckle. But beneath the jest, you saw the sharp mind always calculating morale. Historians still argue whether Caesar's victories in Gaul were due more to his military genius or the disarray of his enemies. "The truth is," he confided one chilly morning while sharpening his sword, "it was both. And a bit of luck. Never underestimate luck." As the Gallic Wars dragged on, the letters he sent back to Rome became more elaborate, painting pictures of triumph that sparkled like a sunset over the Tiber. "They need stories," he said to you after dictating a particularly dramatic account. "And I'll give them stories." When the final victory was his, when the legions roared his name and the Roman standards gleamed under the northern sun, he didn't revel in the glory as you expected. Instead, he stood silent, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Do you hear that?" he murmured. "That's the sound of Rome calling me back." You returned to Rome not with the triumphant blare of horns and cheering crowds. Those came later, but with the quiet knowledge that everything had changed. The Senate grumbled, of course. They whispered that Caesar was growing too bold, too rich, too powerful. They'd rather I had stayed in Gaul, he said one evening, swirling wine in his cup. But I'm not one to outstay my welcome. His arrival sparked a series of power plays that felt less like politics and more like theater. You remember the day he crossed the Rubicon? His words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Alea iacta est," he declared, though later he confided to you with a chuckle, "I said it for effect, it just felt right." Still, the moment was a gamble, a roll of the dice from which there was no retreat. That crossing, though legendary, had its moments of absurdity. The army had to wait for a stubborn mule to decide it was ready to cross the river. "Even fate waits for stubborn mules," Caesar quipped, patting the animal's damp flank. It was a small moment of levity, but it reminded you that even history's greatest turning points had their share of stubborn beasts. The Civil War that followed wasn't one battle, but a series of careful maneuvers, sieges, and negotiations. "Wars aren't won on the battlefield," Caesar muttered more than once. "They're won in minds and letters, in whispers and promises." You saw this firsthand, as he parried not just with swords, but with words, alliances, and just the right amount of coin in the right hands. During the siege of Massilia, as his men grew restless with boredom, Caesar ordered impromptu games, races, mock battles, even a pie-eating contest. "Soldiers need distraction as much as discipline," he explained. When one of the centurions protested that this wasn't proper conduct for a Roman army, Caesar just grinned. "A full stomach fights better than an empty one." In one of those rare, quiet moments, sitting by a campfire overlooking the dark waves of the Adriatic, he shared something few knew. "I used to have a stammer," he confessed, poking at the embers. "It was awful. They said I'd never be a public speaker, but I decided that words could be as powerful as swords, maybe more so." He tilted his head, the firelight playing across his face. And now they listen. One little-known detail from this turbulent time: during his pursuit of Pompey into Greece, Caesar once lost his bearings completely and ended up at a tiny fishing village. The locals, unimpressed, offered him a fish stew. He ate it, proclaiming it the best meal of my life, and stayed the night. "Even a general needs to be reminded he's just a man," he told you as they broke camp the next morning. Historians still debate how much of Caesar's success during the Civil War was strategy and how much was sheer audacity. "Maybe it's both," he mused aloud as he prepared to face Pompey at Pharsalus. "But audacity's more fun, don't you think?" At Pharsalus, when the dust cleared and Pompey's forces were broken, Caesar didn't celebrate. Instead, he sat down in the dirt, wiping sweat and grime from his face, and said, "I should feel victorious, but all I can think about is the cost." His voice was quieter than you'd ever heard it. Victory is a heavy crown. Later, as he stood atop the walls of a captured city, looking out at the Mediterranean glittering like scattered coins, he turned to you and whispered, Do you think they'll remember the battles, or just the man who dared? That question lingered as you followed him through the final chapters of his civil war. Each step a delicate dance between triumph and tragedy. But for now, as the moon rose over the quiet camps, you felt the weight of the future pressing down on your shoulders, a silent reminder that Caesar's story was far from over. The air in Egypt was heavy with spices and the salty tang of the sea. As you disembarked from the ship and took your first steps onto Alexandrian soil, you couldn't help but notice the juxtaposition of grandeur and decay. Towering columns reached toward the sky, while the streets bustled with merchants arguing over bolts of silk and baskets of dates. "It's like Rome, but with better weather," Caesar quipped, shielding his eyes from the bright sun. You hadn't expected the chaos awaiting you. The Alexandrian War was already a swirling mess of factions, and the young Queen Cleopatra seemed more an enigma than a monarch. But when she first emerged from her rug, yes, literally rolled out of a rug in Caesar's chambers, you couldn't help but stifle a laugh. "She certainly knows how to make an entrance," you whispered, earning a sharp elbow from one of Caesar's aides. Cleopatra was more than a spectacle. You saw it in the way Caesar listened to her, the way his usually quick judgments were tempered by her insights. One evening, as you watched them converse under the lamplight, Caesar remarked to you in a low voice, "They think she's just a pretty face, but she has a mind sharper than any sword." And indeed the two plotted and maneuvered with a precision that left even the most seasoned Roman generals scratching their heads. A little-known fact from this time: Caesar once tried to learn a few phrases of Egyptian only to hopelessly mispronounce a greeting during a formal event. Cleopatra laughed so hard she nearly fell from her throne. "Stick to Latin," she teased, her voice lilting like music. During the siege of the royal palace, with flames lighting up the night sky and chaos echoing through the streets, you heard Caesar give orders not just to his soldiers, but to the civilians trapped in the crossfire. "Protect the people, or we'll have no city left to claim," he said, his voice carrying over the clamor. You noticed his exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders, though he masked it with a wry smile. "Besides, if we ruin Alexandria, where would I get my papyrus?" When victory finally came and Cleopatra's throne was secure, you expected him to linger in luxury. But Caesar was restless. One night, under a blanket of stars that shimmered like polished bronze, he murmured, "I could stay here forever, but Rome has a way of calling me back." His voice carried a hint of longing and maybe, just maybe, a touch of regret. Historians still argue about his time in Egypt, whether it was a calculated political move or the result of Cleopatra's charms. "Perhaps it was both," he mused, sipping from a golden cup as you sat beside a low-burning brazier. "But wouldn't you say it was worth it?" As you prepared to depart Alexandria, you witnessed a rare moment of vulnerability. Caesar stood by the shore, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you think they'll remember her?" he asked softly. "Or will they only remember the scandal?" You wanted to reassure him, but the words caught in your throat. Instead, you watched as he turned away, his silhouette framed against the rising sun, a figure both triumphant and tragically human. The return voyage was filled with quiet moments, shared stories, late-night games of dice, and the occasional toast to the future. Rome awaits, he said one evening, raising his cup, and I, for one, am not finished with her yet. Back in Rome, the streets greeted you with a familiar mix of dust and ambition. Caesar's return wasn't just a homecoming, it was a spectacle. The triumphs he staged, lavish, endless processions of treasures, captives, and exotic animals, were both a testament to his victories and a reminder of his power. They want bread and circuses, he said with a soft laugh, watching a pair of elephants awkwardly march past. So, I'll give them elephants. You noticed something different about him. Beneath the laurel wreath and the adulation, there was a restlessness, a man caught between celebration and unease. Power is a fickle friend, he admitted one evening over a quiet dinner. It's like holding water in your hands. You can never quite grasp it. The Senate, of course, was uneasy too. Whispers curled through marble halls like smoke. They muttered about his new laws, his ever-expanding influence, his habit of ignoring old traditions. They say I'm a tyrant, he remarked with a shrug, but I've done nothing they wouldn't do in my place, just faster. A curious moment from these days. During a public festival, a mischievous child somehow slipped past the guards and crowned Caesar with a makeshift paper wreath. Rather than reprimanding the boy, Caesar lifted him high and declared, "A new consul for Rome." The crowd roared with laughter, but you couldn't help noticing the quick flash of irritation on the faces of the senators nearby. Historians still debate whether Caesar intended to declare himself king. "A king in Rome?" he said once, shaking his head. "What would I do with a title like that? The people love me because I'm one of them, or at least I used to be." But as the weeks passed, his power consolidated. More honors, more titles. Dictator perpetuo. The coinage began to bear his image, a move that was subtle, yet seismic. "They'll get used to it," he said, but you heard the uncertainty behind the bravado. Or they won't. Either way, it's done. One lesser-known incident unfolded when a delegation from a remote province arrived to pay tribute. Expecting grand speeches and extravagant gifts, Caesar was instead presented with a simple wooden bowl filled with dates. The elder representing the group knelt and said, "These are the sweetest fruits of our land." Touched, Caesar lifted a date to his lips and, with a playful grin, declared, "Sweeter than Roman politics, I hope." Despite the growing murmurs, his popularity among the common people remained strong. They saw him as a reformer, a man who brought them grain, jobs, and a renewed sense of pride. But you noticed the lines deepening around his eyes, the pauses that grew longer before he spoke. "There's a storm coming," he said quietly one afternoon. "You can feel it in the air." One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city, you walked with him through the Forum. The marble gleamed gold, the voices of merchants and senators blending into a soft hum. He stopped beside a statue of Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. "They built this city with ambition and blood," he said. "I suppose I'm just following in their footsteps." You felt the weight of his words settle over you, a reminder that even the greatest legacies are written with both triumph and tragedy. The streets of Rome stretched out before you, endless and eternal, just as his story was far from over. The day dawned soft and golden, as if Rome itself wanted to lull you into calm before the storm. You'd been by Caesar's side through battles and banquets, through whispered conspiracies and triumphant returns, but today felt different. the Ides of March. The phrase tickled at the back of your mind like a half-remembered tune. Bad day for a meeting, don't you think? You murmured as you adjusted the folds of your cloak. Caesar gave you a half-smile. Every day's a bad day if you listen to soothsayers. His voice was steady, but you caught the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or resignation. The Senate meeting was meant to be ordinary, at least on the surface. But as you approached the theater of Pompey with him, the air felt thick, as though the city itself was holding its breath. "I'll be in and out," he said lightly. "Nothing to worry about." His hand rested briefly on your shoulder, a rare gesture of reassurance. Inside, the mood was tense. Senators clustered together like nervous school children, eyes darting toward Caesar, then away again. You saw one of them drop a scroll, his hand shaking as he stooped to pick it up. Theatrics, you thought, or perhaps something more. Then it happened. Quick, sharp, a flurry of movement and shouts. You heard the first cut, a sound both intimate and brutal. Caesar turned, confusion writ large across his face. "Et tu, brute?" he whispered, though later some would claim he said nothing at all. You were frozen, powerless to stop the unfolding tragedy. A lesser-known detail. As Caesar collapsed, he gathered his cloak around him, covering his legs so he wouldn't fall indecently. It was a small human gesture amid the chaos of betrayal, one that would haunt you long after. Outside, the city erupted into rumors and cries. Some cheered, others wept. You stood alone in the shadows, hearing the distant tolling of bells and the clatter of sandals on stone. This isn't the end, you thought. It can't be. In the days that followed, Rome teetered on the edge. Friends turned into enemies, and those who had cheered for Caesar's downfall suddenly found themselves without a rudder. His funeral was both grand and raw, the people surging like waves as his body was borne through the streets. "You see," you heard someone say, "they loved him after all." The pyre blazed high, the flames licking at the sky, and you felt the heat on your face. This was more than a man, you thought. He was a symbol, a dream, a warning. Historians argue about his final moments, whether he accepted his fate or fought to the end. "Maybe both," you whispered into the rising smoke. "But I think he knew. He always knew." And so you stood there, as ash rained down like confetti, listening to the quiet murmurs of the crowd and the crackle of the fire. Caesar was gone, but his story, his legend, would echo through history, through whispers and dreams, through the very stones of Rome. The flames finally died down, leaving behind a hush so profound it seemed to seep into the very bones of the city. You stood there long after the crowd had dispersed, the last of the smoke curling around your fingers like a fading dream. The stars overhead were distant, softened by the haze of ash and the pale glow of a waning moon. You took a slow, steady breath, letting the weight of it all settle over you like a heavy cloak. The city whispered in its sleep, rustling leaves, the faint echo of sandals on stone, and somewhere far off, the distant lilt of a lullaby being sung to a restless child. You imagined Caesar's voice joining that lullaby, low and gentle, recounting tales of battle and glory, of love and betrayal, of power, both won and lost. You imagined his laughter, his subtle wit, his knack for turning even the darkest moment into a story worth retelling. You found yourself tracing the patterns of the paving stones beneath your feet, following cracks like the delicate lines of a well-read map. Each line, each break, Each curve felt like the roads he had walked, the choices he had made. Somewhere in those lines were the echoes of "Et tu, Brute?" and the soft, resigned gathering of a cloak. The air cooled, and a gentle breeze lifted a lock of hair from your forehead. It was a quiet kind of comfort, the sort that nudges you toward sleep with a promise of dreams wrapped in ancient marble and golden laurel leaves. As you finally turned to leave, you imagined Caesar himself, standing at the edge of the forum, gazing out over the city he'd built, whispering into the shadows, "It's all yours now." And you, with the faintest smile, whispered back, "Sleep well, Julius."